There is a voice in your head that has been with you longer than any relationship you have ever had. It was there before your first heartbreak, before your first failure, before you even had words to describe what was happening to you. And most people spend their entire lives either fighting it, hiding from it, or mistaking it for the truth. Today, that changes. Because what I'm about to share with you is not the usual advice. This is not think positive or be kind to yourself. This is the deeper, stranger, and far more honest story of what your inner critic actually is, where it actually came from, and why everything you've tried to do to silence it has probably made it louder. Let's start with something that will shift how you see this entire conversation. Your inner critic does not live in some dark, broken corner of your mind. It lives in the same brain network responsible for your daydreams. Scientists call it the default mode network, the system that activates when you're not focused on any task, when your mind is wandering, when you're imagining the future or replaying the past. This is the network that is running when you lie in bed at night and the thoughts just keep coming. And this is exactly why the inner critic never fully shuts up. It isn't malfunctioning. It's operating precisely as designed. The moment your attention drifts, the moment you stop being busy, it's right there, not as an intrusion, but as the default, as what your brain does when it's left alone. Now here's where it gets even stranger. The moment the inner critic fires, your brain actually becomes less capable of clear thinking. Research shows that processing self-criticism reduces the brain's ability to access the regions responsible for higher-order reasoning and decision-making. So the voice that is supposed to keep you sharp and accountable is literally making you less capable in the very moment it speaks. You're not thinking more clearly when you self-criticize. You are thinking less clearly, and yet you keep listening because it sounds so convincing. It sounds like it knows something you don't. And here is why it sounds that way. When the default mode network is stuck in self-attack mode, those thoughts don't register as opinions. They register as absolute truths, facts about you. That's why the inner critic feels so relentless, and that's why fighting it head-on rarely works. Because you are not arguing with an enemy. You are arguing with your brain's own default operating system. And that system was never designed to be your friend. They don't arrive labeled, "This is just a thought." They arrive feeling like objective facts about reality. "You're not good enough" doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like something you discovered, something you finally had the courage to admit. That distinction between a thought and a felt truth is one of the most important things you can understand about your own mind. Because you cannot argue your way out of something that doesn't feel like an argument. You cannot counter a fact with positive affirmations. The brain doesn't work that way. And there's one more layer to this that almost no one talks about. When dopamine levels are chronically low, when life feels flat, unrewarding, stuck, the brain actually begins to use self-criticism as a source of stimulation. Think about that for a second. The brain, desperate for any kind of engagement, starts treating self-attack as a form of mental activity. Your suffering becomes a substitute for reward. This is not a metaphor. This is what's happening neurologically for a large portion of people who feel trapped in cycles of self-doubt. The inner critic isn't just punishing you. At some level, it's keeping the lights on. So how did any of this start? Because it didn't begin in adulthood. It didn't begin when you failed that exam or got that rejection or made that mistake. It started much, much earlier, before you even had the cognitive tools to question what you were being taught. Most people assume the inner critic is just a recording of the critical things their parents said to them. And while that's partly true, the real story is darker and more fascinating. Research shows that we don't just repeat the harsh things our parents said to us. We actively turned on ourselves as children in order to preserve the relationship with our parents. Read that again. You didn't just absorb criticism. You generated it yourself, aimed it inward. Because on some unconscious level, a young child knows that blaming themselves is safer than acknowledging that the adults they depend on for survival might be flawed. When a child reaches out with curiosity and love and is met with indifference, contempt, or judgment, the child doesn't conclude that the parent is wrong. The child concludes that they are. Because the alternative, that your entire world, the person who feeds you and keeps you safe, is unreliable, is too terrifying to hold. So the inner critic was born as an act of loyalty, as a form of love even. And that reframe alone can begin to change your relationship with it. But it goes deeper still. Children don't just internalize what their parents said about them. They absorb how their parents speak about themselves. A parent who constantly berates their own decisions, who calls themselves stupid, who is visibly disgusted with their own failures, that child is watching, and they are learning. Not from instruction, but from atmosphere. Your inner critic may not even be rooted in anything your parents said to you directly. It may be a faithful imitation of the way they treated themselves. You might be carrying someone else's self-loathing, as if it were your own original thought. Here is something worth sitting with. You might be able to recognize, if you really listen, that the voice in your head has a particular quality, a specific tone. Maybe it sounds like a person you know. Research confirms that many people, when they pay close attention, can hear the voice of a parent, a teacher, an older sibling. And when you realize that, when you notice this isn't my voice, this is my history playing on repeat, something loosens. You didn't arrive in this world with that voice. It was installed. And anything that was installed can be updated. Now let's talk about why everything you've tried hasn't worked. Because chances are, you have tried to fight the inner critic. You've told it to stop. You've tried to drown it out with motivation and positive quotes. You've argued back, made lists of your accomplishments, tried to prove it wrong. And you may have noticed something strange. The more you fight it, the louder it seems to get. This is not a coincidence. This is not a sign that you are too broken or too weak. This is how it works for everyone. The voice gets louder when you start pushing back against it, almost like a reflex, like something that escalates when it senses resistance. And so the harder you try to silence it, the more energy and attention you pour into the battle, and the stronger it becomes. Here is what almost nobody says about the inner critic, and this might be the most important thing in this entire video. It thinks it is helping you. This is not a poetic metaphor. When researchers and therapists actually work with the inner critic, when they slow down and have a genuine dialogue with it rather than attacking it, they find something unexpected. They find a part that is terrified, a part that has been working overtime, without rest, trying to protect you from humiliation, from failure, from rejection. The criticism, however brutal it sounds, was always in service of something. It believed that if it could just make you see your flaws first, you'd be shielded from the pain of someone else pointing them out. It believed that by keeping you small, it was keeping you safe. This doesn't make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. And comprehension is where transformation begins. There's also something happening inside you that the inner critic is guarding, something that psychology calls an exile, a younger, wounded part of you that holds the original pain. The shame, the feeling of not being enough, the moment you first decided you were too much or not enough. And the inner critic, harsh as it sounds, formed specifically to keep that exile hidden. Because if that wound ever fully surfaced, it might overwhelm everything. So the voice isn't just punishing you. It's protecting something that feels too vulnerable to expose. Heal what the critic is guarding, and the critic no longer has a reason to shout. Now let's talk about what this costs you physically. Because most people think of the inner critic as a psychological problem and stop there. But your body has no wall between what your mind says and what your cells experience. When you are chronically self-critical, your body registers it as a sustained threat. It releases cortisol, the stress hormone, and holds it elevated. And over time, that becomes inflammation, immune suppression, disrupted blood sugar, exhausted sleep, and a kind of fatigue that no amount of rest can fix. Because the brain never actually stopped running. People who carry heavy self-criticism report significantly more physical symptoms than those who don't. The body is listening to every word you say to yourself. Every single one. And there's something else that chronic self-talk does at the neural level that is worth understanding. Every time you reinforce the doubt, every time you hear, I'm not enough, and don't question it. You are strengthening the neural pathway that generates that thought, and simultaneously weakening the pathway that would allow you to receive and hold evidence of your own competence. Your brain literally begins to filter out proof of your capability and amplify proof of your inadequacy. Not because the proof isn't there, but because you have trained the filter to look in only one direction. This is why high achievers can be surrounded by evidence of their success and still feel like frauds. The more you accomplish, the more the stakes feel elevated and the louder the voice becomes, because it is trying harder and harder to manage a greater and greater exposure to failure. Success doesn't silence the critic. Without intervention, it feeds it. So what actually works? Because this would be a hollow video if it ended with the problem and offered nothing. The shift is not a fight. It is a conversation, and not the kind where you try to win. The approach that works, the one that research and decades of clinical practice have consistently supported, is curiosity, not confrontation. When you meet the inner critic with the same compassion you might offer a frightened child, rather than an enemy to be defeated, something unexpected happens. It gets quieter. Not because you overpowered it, because you finally gave it what it was actually asking for, to be heard. You begin by simply noticing it, not being swept away by it, not agreeing with it, not arguing back, just observing it the way you might observe weather from inside a room. This is the first act of separation. The critic is something you can notice, which means it is not everything that you are. There is a you that watches the critic. That observer, that quiet awareness, that is what you're trying to access and strengthen. Because from that place, the words of the inner critic lose their authority. They don't disappear immediately, but they stop being facts. They become data points from a frightened old system doing its best. Then you get curious. You ask, what is this voice afraid of? Not, what is it saying, but what does it fear? Because underneath every "you're not good enough," there is usually a fear. A fear of being rejected. A fear of being seen and found wanting. A fear of loving yourself and then being abandoned. And when you can locate the fear, you can address the fear, which is what the inner critic could never do on its own, because its only tool was volume. Nobody in the self-improvement space wants to admit. The goal was never to silence your inner critic. The goal was always to understand what it's been trying to tell you so clumsily for so long. The critic was only ever screaming because it didn't believe anyone was listening. It was only ever this loud because it thought loudness was the only way to keep you safe. When you finally turn toward it, not to fight it, not to fix it, not to perform acceptance of it, but to genuinely ask what it needs, it begins to shift. Parts that have been frozen in time as protectors start to relax. They start to trust that you can handle the very things they've been shielding you from. And this is where everything shifts. Not in a dramatic flash of breakthrough, but in the quiet, consistent practice of meeting yourself differently. You start to notice that the voice has less grip. Not because you argued it down, but because you stopped being afraid of it. When you're not afraid of a bully, they lose their leverage. When you stop fighting a current, you find you can actually swim. The inner critic does not have to be your enemy. It never was. It was a part of you, doing the only job it ever knew, in the only language it ever learned. Your job now is to teach it a new one. Everything you have ever wanted, the confidence, the clarity, the willingness to take risks, the ability to receive love and success without bracing for it to be taken away, lives on the other side of this relationship. Not on the other side of finally winning the war, on the other side of finally ending it.